Welcome back to RGR Craft. I'm Ryan. This is me going rogue with the help of my friends on craft beer, home brewing, and the beer industry in general. Today we're going to do a little bit of an introductory, and I want to review my technique, whether you're a new brewer or someone who's been doing this forever. If you're brewing at home and not in a professional setting, this is how to do a starter. And starters are really important for a number of different reasons. Whether you're brewing on a Pico brew for 2.5 gallons of a session IPA, or whether you're doing a full 10 gallon of 14% barley wine, this brewing technique is important to use a starter with, no matter where you're coming from. There's one exception, and I will say this because I just want to be real. Kveik yeast is important not to use a starter with, and through some trial and error, I've actually found using about half a pack and being able to use some diluted water that's sanitized, boiled, and then cooled to store the other half actually splits a package, and I think that's perfect for some of the Kveik strains that I'm trying to use in some IPAs. But that said, everything else for me gets a starter, and it goes in a specific way. So we're going to cut into some of that and some of the footage here in a second and go through the process that I use.
I want to keep this pretty simple, but I want to go over the basics of how I'm getting the most out of my yeast and out of my fermentation. And there's two thoughts. I actually only carry on with one of them. I don't do the day-long starter, the 2-day starter, which is the actual propping up, the growing of the number of cells that you have in order to throw into your wort to start the fermentation. I do a vitality starter, and you can search for that a number of ways, but this is what it all boils down to. A vitality starter is something that is smaller, that is done on brew day. I actually pitch mine as my mash is doing its first rest, its dough in rest, usually at 122. And I leave it there anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes, depending on the day and what I'm doing. So it gives me enough time to go back in. And at this point, I will have already pre-cleaned the flask that I use. And I use a stir plate. You don't have to. You can use a shake bottle, a Nalgene bottle I've even seen cracked that people use. I use a stir plate and an Erlenmeyer flask, and I think that works very well for me. The stir bar actually creates the oxygenation, and that's really part of the key. I throw a touch of yeast nutrient in it, and I use proper. And if you haven't used proper, or if you've been scared of doing a starter to begin with for quite a while, proper makes it easy. It's pre-made wort. You combine with 1 can of it with 1 can of water, and bam, you're off and going. Add the yeast, and you're gone. I actually throw in a touch of yeast nutrient, and I have a tendency to hit it with a little bit of oxygen if it's anything above 7% is the ABV that I'm searching for. So that said, to get that, you combine those all, you sterilize it all. I will have cleaned the flask prior to actually transferring my hot liquor onto the grain bed. But with it all already being pre-cleaned and obviously ready to go, the process of actually building the starter is very, very simple. Sanitize everything. The flask, the can, the stir bar, the yeast packet, the scissors, your hands. And you can do this during a first mash rest. Or if you're someone who stays at one temperature for your entire mash, you can do it just as you set the mash, put the lid on the cooler and walk back in and set this up. I usually find that because I do multiple steps, my mash takes a little bit longer on an average day. And as I do everything and I let the yeast settle and I'm ready to transfer, that's an extra, a good 4-hour brew day is plenty of time for me to get yeast up and going. And I find that using the stir plate and getting the oxygenation in there on top of a little bit of yeast nutrient, and I'm not talking a lot, maybe a 1/4 teaspoon, probably less. I find that really works. And it allows the oxygen to help prop up the cell walls of those yeast to get them ready to bud and replicate. And so really what you're doing is you're just taking out that first lag phase so that they hit the wort. And I always do it at room temperature. I set it on my counter in the kitchen and I let it stir itself and I let it do its thing. And it works very well for me. And it takes that lag phase out so that I have found when I've cooled my wort and gotten it ready, there's a lot of things that just makes sense about pitching what is sometimes a full liter. Sometimes I decant and throw less of it, but it makes sense to just put that right into the wort that's ready to go. And the starter has come along quite nicely. It is ready and vital. You can see waves coming through it. It is ready to be pitched. I started the starter just about the same time as the brew, so it should be very lively. With the oxygen hit, it should be ready to hit the ground running and start eating. And it is ready to go into wort that has specifically been settled out after whirlpooling and been transferred into the fermenter. I usually let it sit just a little bit longer, tap off the very top end of the foam of the yeast, get it good and set. Now, if I'm doing if I obviously don't have to do this, but the temperature would be quite hotter. But I'm usually doing this right about 66 degrees, and that works very, very well. So you take the volume that you've created, put it right in, and I find that I actually have activity within 4 or 5 hours after pitch, and that is exactly what I am looking for.
That's the gist of how I go about using a starter for all of my brews, whether they're small, big, medium, or just gigantic ABV. So let me know what you guys think. If you have questions or if you have a different technique that you like better, leave it down in the comments below. Mike and I are going to get back together in the coming weeks and have part of this discussion with him as well, because he has a slightly different way of doing it. But it's also some coming content for you as well. I have a brew day coming up that we're going to have the full video for. We have some more beer reviews. Keep spreading the word about craft beer here on the RGR Craft podcast here on YouTube. I appreciate everything you guys have done and checking this one out, and we'll catch you next time.